And yeah, it's an aerosol, so it doesn't matter. Hey, Elijah and Griffin, we're just talking about COVID and how little we knew at the beginning. Well, again, I appreciate you all protecting each other by wearing them. And I also really appreciate that folks have been really good about, like, if someone they know tests positive, you know, not coming in, that all that is going to help. Because I've heard of, within the past 24 hours, I've heard of 3 people who have tested positive. So I think numbers are going back up. Yeah. I mean, no one that I've had close contact with, but.
And then it's because of weather change. It's going on to more.
Yep. And so people are inside more, and then you're breathing on each other and all that fun stuff. I do like fall here, and I do appreciate that we actually got a fall as opposed to not so much usually. Believe it here, oftentimes it's, you know, like 90 through October. So I appreciate that. Like the first day of fall, it was like, nah, and then all of a sudden it was like, oh, okay, I'll be fallish. That's fine. Alrighty, so our warm-up activity today is up here on the screen. I'm gonna try and leave it this way so that the information isn't cut off. But my question for today is, if you were a post-Freudian, which part of Freud's theory would make you break off and start your own version of a theory? Huh. Let me try presenting it. Did it change on your screen? All right. I will reactivate it and see how that goes. Is anyone besides the first person actually being able to get your answers through? Okay, there we go. Woohoo! All right. There we go. Now it'll start popping up. Alrighty, so as these come in, I'm gonna go to the bottom and start reading them. So again, our question is, if you were a post-Freudian, which part of Freud's theory would make you break off and start your own theory? And so the stages of development that he believed we would get fixated on if we didn't progress through them right. Probably the penis envy theory he had. I don't think all women mourn they're not having male genitalia. Yeah, I could see, yep, that being an issue. I'd be interested in investigating the points of development that we might never outgrow if we did not process that time correctly. I think it'd be interesting to see how many people today would fall under the category of this theory. Yeah, I could definitely look into that. The theory of the unconscious hosting most of our personality seems a bit of a reach. I'd break off and do my own theory about the penis envy. I'm seeing a theme here. I would do more research on ways to prove Freud was wrong. I would break off and talk more about the ego and how our ego helps us function. This is very consistent with the folks that we've been talking about. The ego functions in the conscious, pre-conscious, and unconscious mind, which I find fascinating, and that somehow our ego could be unconscious. About the phallic stage and try to do more research to gain evidence if there's any truth to this stage. Yeah. Developmental stages and maybe the ego. The amount of in-depth study on the fixation stages, he went a little too far. I think the fixation stages are critical to research, but don't necessarily need to go into sexual situations. I'd look more into something like Erickson created. Yeah, these are great responses, y'all. Very thought-provoking, very well thought out. You all always, like, I don't know why I continue to be amazed. I should have be used to it by now, but you all are so articulate first thing in the morning when we do these, which is great. I don't think I could write anything this coherent, like my first class of the day. So good for y'all. I break off from the id, yep, and that it's the only one out of the id, ego, and super ego that's present from birth. Awesome. So yeah, I will just keep doing these because I think they're a nice way to kind of get our discussions rolling without us having to, you know, necessarily talk. And then just a couple reminders for our schedule here. One is that, let me get to Karen Horney here. There we go. One is that today was supposed to be a discussion day. But what we're doing is just finishing our lecture just because it's going to make more sense. And then that means Friday, we're going to have our discussion day about Freud. There's only one reading for Friday, and it's one that Freud wrote himself. And we'll do some other activities on Friday related to that. And then we'll go back to our regularly scheduled syllabus on Monday and have a discussion day for the post-Freudians. So you'll read readings by Jung and by Horney. It's not Jung and horny as much as people on Cafe Press like to have fun with that on t-shirts. And then we'll do sort of modern reactions to Freud next Wednesday. We'll read something by Baumeister. We'll read a great piece by Gloria Steinem that makes fun of Freud. And then there is an interesting article by a psychoanalyst about research and psychoanalysis. So yeah. Yes, it's pretty great. She kind of takes all his ideas and like flips them gender-wise. So it's fun. Yeah. All right, actually real quick, I just realized I need to grab something for our Zoom folks before I get started. So let me do that. Because you all are getting a handout, but clearly they can't. So I'm going to throw this in the chat for you guys who are on Zoom. This is the link to the handouts I'll be sharing. And then I'm going to pass the handouts actually around to the folks who are here in person. There we go. This is just a little bit more in-depth information about Horney's theories. I'm just going to have you pass to everybody else if you're cool with that. Alrighty. Yeah, this is like a copy of a copy that I got when I took this class when I was in college, so it's not the best. But it does help explain this stuff. I should just recreate it at some point, but I've been too lazy, so full disclosure, being as transparent as I can with y'all. No, it's the same one, the post-Freudian psychodynamic folks. So we had talked about Horney and her background and the idea of womb envy. And so now we're going to start talking about how she explained personality. And so one thing I should do to give us more perspective before I dive into this is explain that Horney was horribly abused by her father. So her father physically abused her, may have also sexually abused her. And so I feel like that context is really important when we start to talk about her theories, because otherwise, if you yourself grew up in a sort of generally healthy, happy household, this feels really out of left field. So Horney said that parts of personality were the basics. And the first one of those that she talked about is basic evil. And so if you have sort of the giant chart here, as you can see, that's the very first thing. The basic evil, and this was the basic evil of parents. And again, you're like, well, hold up, well, what? But again, remember, she was abused, and that's where this was coming from. So according to Horney, basic evil was done to children when parents are indifferent to them. This was about parental selfishness, indifference, disrespect, lack of love, parents who were overly harsh in their punitiveness, and again, Horney being abused by her father. You could see where this idea would come from. And she said what that led to, sort of the second thing over on your diagram here, is basic hostility. And she said this is rage that's in it, that is activated by the basic evil of the parents in the child. And it's rage directed at the parents. And she recognized that this is problematic, because if you're raging against your parents when you're young, this is who you need the most, right? They're the ones who in theory should be clothing you, feeding you, all that good stuff. So this is a no-win position. And so then, again, if we're following through on the chart, that leads to conflict, anxiety, and this would be sort of like the Freudian idea of anxiety and neurosis, right? Helplessness, and then need and love. And then you'd be using some defense mechanisms to try to modulate this. So repressing things, retroflexing means turning your rage back in on yourself, right? Because it's not acceptable to turn it on your parents. And then that leads to what she says was basic anxiety. And this is similar to Adler's concept of inferiority. This is Erickson's trust versus mistrust, shame, guilt, feelings of inferiority, doubt. And the idea was you've got your basic hostility already. You're trying to like suppress this rage. And then you've got this basic anxiety, and you can't live a life just caught between rage and anxiety, right? Like that's not sustainable. And so you need a compromise. And what Horney did is she argued that we sort of create a split in our personality to avoid further conflict. So this is this need for security and defensive compromise on the chart. And so she argued that there are neurotic needs and that these are rigid, inflexible, absolutist, infused with hostility towards the self, usually. And so the idea is, again, we're taking this anxiety, we're taking this rage that we don't know what to do with, and we apply it to ourselves. And so This becomes neurotic when it's disproportionate. And this came her idea of the tyranny of the shoulds. The idea that when we have this much basic anxiety and hostility, our mind starts telling us that we should do something or we must do something. And if we don't, then something horrible is going to happen, right? So if you just sit now for a second and think about a list of all the things you have to do, like before fall break, right, the next 3 weeks. How overwhelming would it be to allow yourself zero flexibility in that, right? To say, I can't watch any Netflix between now and then. I can't go on YouTube. I can't like even have lunch with my friends. I must just get this all done. So you kind of see how sometimes this has been played with humor, where you say like, you're shoulding all over yourself, or I just should myself. So one of Horney's students that we'll learn about later in the semester was Ellis. And he really ran with this idea of musts and shoulds. He would talk about people masturbating and shoulding on themselves. And the idea is this becomes so confining that it's like creates this level of perfectionism that no one can withstand. No one can do that. No one can sustain it. And so this becomes something we need to try to deal with. And so what she argued people develop are these protective strategies. And these are neurotic interpersonal styles. And so these are things like being self-effacing, moving towards people, putting your own needs and wants last to try to like get human connection. If you love me, you won't hurt me. We know that's not true, unfortunately, right? In the vast majority, I think, of scenarios, yeah. In general, we're not trying to hurt people we love, but there are some really effed up people out there, right? Mastery is moving against. If I have power, no one can hurt me. So that's kind of like walling yourself up and trying to be even more perfectionistic, right? And then resignation is moving away. If I withdraw from everyone else and I don't have close relationships, then no one can hurt me that way. And so if you turn this over, you've got table 11-2. Folks on Zoom, it's a different file in that folder, and I think it's sideways, so I apologize. And so these are those things. So the self-effacing solution, love, moving towards compliance. These folks have a need for affection and approval. They want their partner to take control. And they live their life in the narrow borders of what their partner wants them to do. If you love me, you won't hurt me. And we're going to talk about her different ideas of the self next. The expansive solution, the mastery, the moving against, the aggression. These folks need power and omnipotence and perfection. They'll exploit others to get where they need to be. They want social recognition and prestige above all else. They want personal admiration and achievement. And then the resignation solution, sometimes called freedom, moving away, detachment. You restrict your life to narrow borders. You try to be self-sufficient, and you still have this perfection and inaccessibility. Obviously, all these solutions are not great, right? And there's a lot of things that end up going on as you try to deal with the basic hostility, the basic anxiety, these shoulds and musts in your life. And so what Horney argues happens is that we create different visions of ourselves. And so if you look at table 11.1 on the back, she talked about, we'll start with number 2, the real self. The real self is the true core of who we are. It is our potential for growth. It is who we really are. Self-realization. It is if you just said like, who are you? Who do you want to be? The real self is what you would be getting at. What Horney argues happens is because of basic anxiety and these neurotic needs, the real self becomes despised. And she actually terms it the despised real self. And this is like a version of our real self we work up in our mind that is weak and unacceptable and not meeting our standard. We have false conceptions about our own competence, our worth, our lovability, based on belief in how other people are thinking of us. Again, if we're going to Horney's theory of particularly thinking about our parents. Negative evaluations of ourselves or by other people can reinforce this sense of helplessness. So she argues, okay, so you've got the real self, you've got this despised real self. What happens, what you end up living as is the actual self. And this is the objectively existing person, physically and mentally, independent of anyone else's perceptions. It's just who you're being right now. It's sort of how we cope on a day-to-day basis, right? Like, this is how I got to move through the world. And it's probably not something I actively chose, right? And then the ideal self is the damaged real self. It's hurt by negative evaluations and the indifference from this basic evil of the parents. It struggles with the tyranny of the shoulds. It strives to be perfect in a wishful way, as compensation for feelings of inadequacy and inferiority. So what you end up with here is you're living this life with all these different ideas of who you should be, usually ignoring who you really are, right? Just sort of like going through as like who you have to exist as to survive. So Horney argued that this alienates you from your real self. And so this leads to contradictions, to conflict, to even more anxiety, to self-hate, and loss of control. And then what Horney argued is if you don't address this, and then you become a parent, right? That's where the basic evil comes back in. Because you don't mean to, but because you're sort of dealing with your own stuff, you're going to have this indifference and whatnot. It's not a very positive outlook on life, right? Fully acknowledging that. It is, I think, again, rooted in her reality, rooted in the reality for a lot of women at the time she was living. Women were sort of seen as not as worthy as like sons, for example. And so you would often have to sort of like fight for attention and respect and things along those lines. Do I think that this is the way things go based on my experience? No. Is this probably the lived experience of some people who come from terrible households? Sure, right? And so I think that, again, it's always important to kind of think about where did these folks come from and where would these ideas stem from? So Horney herself, the most influential part is what we talked about on Monday, her feminine psychology. And that really influenced what we would now call feminist psychology. But these ideas, rooted in some of these ideas, were the seeds of what really influenced modern psychotherapy, particularly through Ellis and another of her students, Aaron Beck. All right, so as we've been pointing out, and as a lot of you said in your warm-up activity, ego psychology was where it was at. People were shifting in their focus from thinking about the id to focusing on the ego. And the ego is involved in trying to master our environment, achieve our goals, establish an identity in some way, and that the primary role of the ego should be establishing a secure identity. Alrighty, Carl Jung. So Jung was alive from 1875 to 1961. He was born in Switzerland. He originally wanted to be an archaeologist, but he could only afford med school. Med school was cheaper than getting a PhD back then. And also with med school, you also start making money more quickly, right? Because you can start seeing patients and charging them. And so that's what he rolled with. His first professional assignment was with Eugene Bleuler. I can never pronounce this man's name particularly correctly. But for those of you who have taken adult psychopathology, this name might kind of ring bells. He was the first person to coin the term schizophrenia. He was studying people with psychopathology, severe psychopathology. And so Jung got to train under him. He met Freud in 1907, and they were mutually impressed with each other. I kind of love that way of putting it. And Freud at that time said, Jung, he's going to be my intellectual heir. He's a great guy. This is who we're going to roll with. And in fact, Jung was just sort of like, sure, yeah. And then by 1913, not very long after, right, he became a dissenter of Freud for a whole bunch of different reasons. Again, like a lot of the people we've talked about, Freud was just putting too much emphasis on sex and aggression for Jung. And Freud never forgave Jung's defection, like to the point that they stopped talking to each other. They did not speak to each other for the rest of their lives. It's like very like high school catty in some ways. But again, Freud really had staked a lot on Jung being the person to carry on his legacy. And so he felt very betrayed. And again, all along, he's just ignoring Anna, who was the person to carry on his legacy, right? So again, this kind of goes with some of Horney's ideas about daughters at the time being sort of ignored. Jung had a lot of influences. So again, remember that he wanted to be an archaeologist, right? He was someone who was really interested in things like Eastern mysticism, mythology, alchemy. And so he developed his own school of thought that was called analytical psychology. So I do have a video here on Jung.
And how long was it after you took?
So this is an interview with Jung, and he's going to talk about meeting Freud.
That decision that you first came in contact with Freud?
Oh, you know, that was at the end of my studies, and then it took quite a while until I met Freud. You see, I finished my studies in 1900, and I met Freud only very much later. I read, in 1900, I already read his dream interpretation and the Freud studies about hysteria. But that was merely literary, you know. And then in 1907, I became acquainted with him personally.
Will you tell me how that happened? Did you go to Vienna?
Oh, well, I'd written a book about the psychology of dementia precox, as one called schizophrenia then. And I sent him that book, and thus we became acquainted. I went to Vienna for a fortnight then, and then we had very long and penetrating conversations.
Such a Freudian term, penetrating conversations. One of the things that, if you didn't catch up on it, that I have always thought is really ballsy is Jung is like, I wrote this book, so I just sent Freud a copy. Like, good for you, man. Like, get it out there to the biggest sort of intellect at your time.
And that settled it.
And this long and penetrating conversation was followed by personal friendship.
Oh, yes, it soon developed into a personal friendship.
And what sort of man was Freud?
Well, he was a complicated nature, you know. I liked him very much, but I soon discovered that when he had thought something, then it was settled, while I was doubting all along the line. And it was impossible to discuss something really a fond. You know, he had no philosophical education, particularly, you see, I was studying Kant, and I was steeped in it, and And that was far from Freud. So from the very beginning, there was a discrepancy.
Did you in fact grow apart later, partly because of a difference in temperamental approach to experiment and proof and so on?
Well, of course, there is always a temperamental difference. His approach was naturally different from mine because his personality was different from mine. That led me into my later investigation of psychological types. There are definite attitudes. Some people are doing it in this way and other people are doing it in the other typical way. And there were such differences between myself and Freud too.
Do you consider that Freud's standard of proof and experimentation was less high than your own?
Well, you see, that is an evaluation I'm not competent of. I am not my own history or my historiographer. With reference to certain results, I think my method has its merits.
Tell me, did Freud himself ever analyze you?
Oh yes, I had submitted quite a lot of my dreams to him, and so did he.
And he to you, yes?
Oh yes,
yes.
Yes.
Do you remember now, at this distance of time, what were the significant features of Freud's dreams that you noted at the time?
Well, that is rather indiscreet to ask. You know, there is such a thing as a professional secret.
He's been dead these many years.
Yes, but these regards last longer than life.
So he's arguing that for him, confidentiality extends past death, which I think is really ethical in its own way.
I prefer not to talk about it.
Well, may I ask you something else then, which perhaps is also indiscreet? Is it true that you have a very large number of letters which you exchanged with Freud, which are still unpublished?
Yes.
When are they going to be published?
Well, not during my lifetime.
You would have no objection to them being published after your life?
Oh, no, not at all.
Because they are probably of great historical importance.
I don't think so.
Then why have you not published them so far?
Because they were not important to me enough. I see no particular importance.
I mean, this just shows humbleness, right? I'm sure that anything Jung and Freud were exchanging was probably very intellectual and like creating theory of psychology, but yeah, definitely some humility here.
In them.
They are concerned with personal matters?
Well, partially. But I wouldn't care to publish them.
Well, now, can we move on to the time when you did eventually part company with Freud? It was partly, I think, with the publication of your book, The Psychology of the Unconscious. Is that correct?
That was the real cause.
Well, now, before you...
Oh, I mean the final cause, because it had a long preparation. You know, from the beginning, I had a reservatio mentalis. I couldn't agree with quite a number of his ideas.
Which ones in particular?
Well, chiefly his purely personal approach and his disregard of the historical conditions of man. You see, we depend largely upon our history. We are shaped through education, through the influence of the parents, which are by no means always personal. They were prejudiced or they were influenced by historical ideas or what I call dominance. And that is a most decisive factor in psychology. And we are not of today or of yesterday. We are of an immense age.
Was it not partly your observation, your clinical observation of psychotic cases which led you to differ from Freud on this?
It was partially my experience with schizophrenic patients that led me to the idea of certain general historical conditions.
And that's what we're going to talk about next, is Jung's ideas about that. So that is just such an interesting flip, because you see, like, from the beginning, it was sort of like an uneasy partnership, right, between him and Freud, where they were like already maybe disagreeing, but started with mutual respect. So Jung went in a totally different direction than Freud. Jung argued, and you kind of heard him talking about it in the last part of that clip, that we are influenced by the entirety of human history. And he called this the collective unconscious. He said that this is, and these are, memories and ideas that all humans share, most of which reside in the unconscious. He said it was the sum total of all human experience and existence, and shared by all humans. So he thought that essentially all humans had like a collective memory just by being humans. He said that there is an inherent tendency of disposition to have certain fundamental experiences, things like prescribed social roles, emotions, language and symbolization, trying to find the perfect mate or other in your life, and that this was transcendent of time and culture. I have to say, when I teach clinical psychology, we talk about Freud and Jung, and my book has actually updated to drop this one, but maybe 10 years ago when I first started using the case study book I used, they had a Jungian case study where they talked about dream interpretation from Jung's perspective. And I'm glad they took it out, because I struggled to understand what the heck they were talking about. It's very like, you got to be steeped in his ideas to get what's going on. And part of his ideas that were really influential were the ideas of archetypes. And these are the core ideas of how people think about the world, both consciously and unconsciously. He said these are universal themes that we see over and over again throughout human history, and they're organized as these archetypes. And this is a universal thought form, or maybe a predisposition to respond to the world in certain ways. He said archetypes are never fully known. They always remain in our unconscious, but that we see them come out symbolized in myths, in dreams, in art. And these were things like the idea of the Earth Mother, a hero figure, a devil, a supreme being, right? I actually don't know of any particular ancient culture that didn't have some sort of understanding of a supreme being or multiple supreme beings, right? Most people have created an idea of God, right? Or goddess, or multiple gods and goddesses. And so he also argued there was a connection here to greater cosmic processes. So the persona is the role we play in society. This is the mask we wear to adjust to society. So this is very similar to Horney's idea of the actual self. We are assigned roles and we have to try to fit within them. The shadow represents the unsociable, the taboo, unacceptable thoughts. This is a necessary companion with the persona. And he argued that we would be incomplete without a shadow, and that a lot of the negative things that we don't like in our society or in ourselves are the manifestation of the shadow. So sort of like everybody kind of having their evil side or bad side. If we go back to the idea of psychomachia, an angel on one shoulder and a devil on the other, right? This is that devil on our shoulder. anima is the feminine archetype. And he argued that everyone has an anima. So it's the feminine part of even the male psyche. And he argued that in particular, the anima was related to our ability to enter into relationships. And then the animus is the masculine archetype. So again, to be the masculine part of the female psyche. And he argued that this is rational and analytical. Again, we see very gendered norms and ideas about what's feminine, what's masculine, right? And Jung would argue these just come from the collective unconscious. I think other people would argue something very different. And then there's the self. And the self is striving for unity with all the parts of the personality. It directs the orderly distribution of psychic energy and the psychic forces so that all parts of the personality are integrated and represented appropriately. To Jung, this was the center or the midpoint of personality. And he said that development of the self is our life's goal. But he also argued that we don't begin to fully develop the self until middle age. So this is something we're like always striving to get to. And for Jung, the key to mental health was opening up to this collective unconscious. Again, he was interested in things like Eastern mysticism. If we think about sort of modern ideas about meditation and mindfulness and connection, this sort of predates that, right? But Jung believed you were not a whole person until you opened up to everything within you. He also said you're going to be off balance if you deny any part of it. So I have a brief activity before we end for today. So either on your computer or a piece of paper, whatever works for you, think of someone you know whom you don't like very much. Maybe you even hate this person. Write down a description of that person. Write down what it is about this individual's personality that you do not like. Be as specific as you can. So again, feel free to just pull up a Word document or write it on a piece of paper, however you want to do it. And I'll give you about 2 minutes to do this. We don't want to go too far into hatred, right? So think of someone you know who you don't like very much. Maybe you even hate them. On a piece of paper or on your computer, write down a description of that person. Write down what it is about that individual's personality that you don't like, that you can't stand, and be as specific as you can. Give you just like a few more seconds here to think about this. It's okay if you don't get to everything. Alrighty, so now if you actually wrote this on a piece of paper, draw a box around it. If it's on your computer, no need. But then on the top, write my shadow. So what Jung would argue is what we hate the most in other people is our own shadow side. So what you've written down, according to Jung, is some hidden part of yourself. Some part you have suppressed or hidden. It's what Jung would call your shadow. Maybe it's a part of you that you fear, can't accept, or hate for some reason. Maybe it's a part of you that needs to be expressed or developed in some way. maybe you even secretly wish you could be something like the person that you hate. So reactions to that. Obviously, it's Jungian. I'm not saying this is cut and dry. Yeah.
I think I used to have some of the traits of this person, and I worked really hard to not have them anymore.
Oh, that makes sense.
So
Yeah.
now I feel like they should be the same. So that's kind of why I'm resentful.
That makes, yeah, a lot of sense.
What about the people who actually want me?
Right. And like, then are we self-harming? I don't know. It's interesting to kind of wrap your head around it, right? Yeah, one of the things on the notes for that activity that it says is like, think about whether, that's been like a really close friend, or even if you didn't think of a close friend or a romantic partner when you did that, like look at it now and see like, are there traits of people who you're close to still who are on that list? Again, fully disclosing it's Jungian, right? I'm not saying this is the be all end all and all of you should go home and be like, oh my God, I'm a horrible person, right? But just something interesting to think about. Alrighty, so Friday, we're gonna do our discussion about Freud. I have a little activity we'll do with that, and then we'll have our group discussion as well.